So let's get started. Folks can trickle in as needed. My name is Gordon Hull. I'm the director of the Ethics Center here at UNC Charlotte. I'd like to take a minute to welcome everybody, particularly those of you that we haven't seen before. I'm really glad that you were able to join us this afternoon. Today's talk will be the second in our series on models for equitable minority inclusion in institutional research, being sort of most of the work is actually being done by my colleague Lisa Rasmussen, so she gets an enormous thank you for all of that. We have a couple more talks coming, probably in the spring. We'll have those for you. You can keep up with the Ethics Center at ethics.uncc.edu. And of course, we have Facebook and Instagram and a YouTube channel now where you'll be able to find this talk in a few days. And there's also closed captioning available should you need that. There's your button down well, maybe. Is the closed captioning working? Okay. So today's speaker is Alex Pearlman, and we were talking before we started. She has many hats apparently. So here's some of them. She's a journalist, a bioethicist. She's a digital ethnographer at the Wexler Lab at University of Pennsylvania and an affiliate of the MIT Media Lab. And we are very fortunate to have her today, where she will talk about a framework for collectively defining ethical standards in community biology. So looking sort of drilling down at how we might think about these frameworks for approaching equity in institutional research. So Alex, all yours.
Hi, thank you so much, Gordon, and thank you for organizing this, to you and Lisa, and thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be able to speak at centers in North Carolina without actually having to go to North Carolina, and I'm can stay comfortably here in Santa Monica, and we can all still be together and have this talk. So thank you so much for inviting me and for hosting me and for being interested in this really interesting topic. So I'm Alex. I am, as Gordon says, a journalist, but I'm also a bioethicist. And my research sort of spans a lot of areas, but my most interesting research has to do with community biotechnology and the community bio movement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what community bio is, sort of its history and where it came from, and then talk about more specifically a framework that we devised for collectively defining ethics norms across the community bio movement. So that said, I know that the series is meant to be about models on equitable research for minority inclusion and institutional research. And like community bio often does with basically everything, we're going to flip that on its head today. And so we're going to talk about a model for equitable research and inclusion outside of institutions, because community bio is by its very nature outside of institutions. But what's really cool about it is community bio can also be a testing ground for a lot of ideas that then can make their way into institutions to be used to be more radical, be more inclusive, be more transparent, be more open. So those are things that community bio strives for and often achieves that institutions sort of lag behind. So this is a great way to talk about sort of models that institutional research can sort of borrow from, build on. So I'll just get to it. I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides, but I also want to be, I'm going to sort of go quickly because I definitely want to leave a lot of room for discussion and debate and questions, especially for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with the community bio movement and sort of what that means, as well as people from inside institutions. I would love to hear what you think of how this could work inside of your institutions and your sort of places of work. So we're going to leave some time for that. So I'm going to just share. Okay. Can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Do you see the slides or do you see the notes?
Just the slide, but also your top and bottom bars.
Okay. Does it switch?
The slides do, but still see your top and bottom bars.
Up here?
Yes.
Okay, here, let's make this full screen. All right, is that better?
Better, we can still see the top bar. I think when you select which screen to share, you can select just the slides.
Weird.
It's not particularly disruptive, so.
Okay. Okay. I think maybe we'll just keep it if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. So, like I said, I'm going to go through some terminology and history of community bio. And we're going to talk about some different terms that are used because one of the biggest issues that I see in talking about community bio is people being like, well, is it citizen science? Is it biohacking? What is it? And so we're going to talk through sort of like terminology and where those things overlap. And then quickly look at some major events in sort of the history of community bio. And then I'll talk a little bit about research that I did with a great team at Baylor, led by my colleague, Christy Gorini, that really looked sort of at the ethics, opinions, and challenges within the movement by doing interviews and talk about sort of our findings and how that informed the creation of this framework that we came up with for the Community Biosummit. So community bio, what is it? It's important to know that regardless of terminology, groups and individuals that are engaged in independent bioresearch have one thing in common, and that's mostly that they're bottom up and totally horizontal organizations. Often, these are not top down institutionalized groups. So they work outside of traditional research spheres such as academia, government, and industry. And so largely this is independent groups who are maybe working on a startup model or maybe working more on community groups model. But the one thing that they have in common is that they're mostly bottom-up organizations. So sometimes we call it like a fleet of pirate ships because there's no central hub, it's totally decentralized, there's no CEOs. Boards of directors exist at community labs, but maybe not in a centralized level. And so like pirate ships, there's no one ship that really steers the fleet, but there is sort of a shared sense of norms and ethics that sort of permeate across the community. And so the issue had been that those ethics and values that were shared hadn't really been identified recently. So I love this slide because it has so many words that mean so many things to so many people. And so you see that there's life sciences, there's bioengineering, and then below that is these sort of bottom up, horizontal sort of groups, movements, phrases, and sort of they all overlap with each other. Basically, citizen science and DIY bio were movements that emerged sort of around 15 years ago. And I think that for our purposes, what we've sort of decided as a movement is that community bio is really an evolution of a lot of these sort of predecessor movements. So whereas DIY bio emerged after synthetic biology started to become easier and cheaper and moved sort of like out of academic labs into independent labs and community labs, they started networking with each other and started connecting to each other. And over the past 15 years or so, these networks have tightened and emerged and solidified so that the DIY experience is no longer a solitary endeavor. It's not a do-it-yourself thing, it's a community thing. And there's so much collaboration between folks who would once maybe consider themselves biohackers or DIYers. Now it's like community bio is this sort of evolution of the concept of DIY. So here is another even more confusing graphic that I love, because when we talk about sort of community bio, it's basically all of this. It's DIY science, it's research, it's policy, it's folks thinking about sort of like the evolution of policy and how to handle research that comes out of non-institutionalized, non-establishment places. It's entrepreneurship, because so many of these labs that maybe started, companies that maybe started at community labs have emerged into the startup space and are getting venture funding. So it's definitely entrepreneurship. It's definitely fab labs and maker spaces. It's definitely that has pieces of the hacker movement. There's a lot of really interesting IP questions, borrowing ideas, open science communication issues. And so really it's all of these things together is community bio. Okay, so I'll just give a little bit more quick history about some notable projects and dig into sort of how the movement grew. So some of these folks might be familiar to you, and these are people who consider themselves biohackers, who have been covered in sort of a very sensationalist way over the past 5 or so years in the mainstream media, doing all kinds of performative self-experimentation with DIY gene therapies and other sort of like healthcare interventions. Unfortunately, this is not community bio. And so the conversation that I want to just make very clear when we talk about biohacking is that this is a small group of people that you see in the media, does not represent what we mean by community bio. And it's unfortunate that the media continues to focus on these individuals, especially since there's so much other great work going on. So I just wanted to flag that this is largely not what we're talking about. And instead, we're talking about stuff like this. So there are so many non-establishment projects that are less sensationalist than what you see like biohackers in the media, but also exist outside of institutionalized traditional research. And the fact is that community labs and community projects, community bio projects have popped up in dozens of countries all over the world. And many are focused on education, outreach, following the example of the maker movement. So many are providing public spaces for amateurs and hobbyists to come in, learn about synthetic biology, learn about sort of basic bio tools and toolkits. And like we said, some are focused on sort of opening up and creating networks like Just One Giant Lab, Joggle, which is a platform for community bio folks to sort of network with each other and work on very specific project-focused endeavors, like the Open COVID-19 project that they have currently. Other ones like Open Insulin or the Fourth Use Vinegar projects, Pepijn, are really focused on interrupting pharmaceutical pipelines to make healthcare products more accessible, and really coming at this from a social justice and harm reduction bent. And the motivation is really one about opening doors and making healthcare more accessible. So Open Insulin is, as we can see, developing the first freely open organisms for insulin production that will be practical for small scale, locally based groups. And then there are groups like Shiel-Rolle, which is based in Salinas, California. It's a community lab that's pushing a bioeconomy centered in racial and class equity that advances justice for the next 7 generations. So there's this, you can see there's this really strong focus on equity and accessibility for folks who maybe have felt like they have been locked out of institutions for years. Maybe there's no place for them. Maybe they didn't come from countries or backgrounds or socioeconomic positions where getting a synthetic biology advanced degree was out of reach or maybe not in the cards. And this opens up a lot of doors for basically anyone the whole idea is to radically reconsider what is science and how is it accessible to folks, and making it super open. That in itself is very radical. And so, but it's also really exciting. And so the movement has really been growing quite quickly. And so while the DIY bio and biohacking movement sort of emerged and evolved into what we now see as community bio, these networks that were forming online began to take shape and began to solidify, like I was saying. And it created these pipelines where practitioners were seeking advice from peers, collaborating, sharing tips with newcomers, setting up all kinds of interesting projects for sharing information, for sharing DNA, for sharing the open enzyme projects, ships all kinds of materials all over the world. And then also really focusing on creating a structure underneath this information that is open source, so that anyone can use it, build on it, and make it better. And so as this movement started evolving, I was watching this and I started thinking to myself, wow, there is no oversight for a lot of these projects. And so as a lot of them evolved into sort of a health intervention space, looking at human subjects research, potentially, I started asking a lot of questions about oversight and sort of policy interventions, and what are the ways that folks who are doing this amazing work might consider that they need peer review, want peer review, but no one had really asked the community themselves what it is that they wanted or needed. And I think that this was a massive opportunity to do that. So while there had been a handful of articles that have been written, scholarship that had been done looking at sort of the DIY message boards, looking at old emails since about 2011, and Todd Kukin is on this call, hi Todd, was the last time that there had really been like an investigation of what the ethics positions were inside the community. And so since then, there has been this enormous growth of people and projects and groups and a global sort of explosion in folks who are participating in the community bio movement. And so it was time, I thought, to sort of dig deeper into what folks really were wanting and needing, and felt that the community was lacking in terms of ethics oversight. So luckily I'm not alone, and there are like a lot of people who also consider that to be a priority issue. And so I worked with Christy Guarini and a team at Baylor to do a bunch of research, including attending all the biohacker conferences and all the community bio conferences, and interviewing as many folks as we could about what the attitudes were towards ethics oversight. So we identified a few reasons why folks would be in favor of ethics oversight of some kind. And that includes protection from regulators. So there's a lot of chatter within the community of sort of policing or the government sort of clamping down, and concerns about what the community really could be doing. And there's this constant sort of noise in the background that there are concerns from regulators that there are bad actors in the community. And so if there was some sort of ethics oversight, that might mitigate that noise. And it's largely unfounded. And I just have to say that there really is not a lot of evidence for this, but it's this continuous sort of noise, these like rumors and feelings from regulators that there are bad actors in the community. Another reason is to commercialize projects, without going through a peer review system or a system of checks and balances and considerations of ethics. It just helps to get to start to commercialize projects. And like I said, the community itself wants to be able to anticipate its own bad actors without getting regulated or policed from the outside. There's this very strong feeling for self-regulation, and that some sort of ethics oversight of the work that's going on might be a tool to stand in the way of bad actors sort of emerging or taking the spotlight, as has happened before, or people who are doing sensationalist experiments. So, but that said, there is a ton of reasons that we heard that folks are not in favor of this. So this is just to say that the suggestion that there should be some sort of regulatory oversight from within the community is still very contentious, and it's a controversial debate, which is great. And so some of the reasons that folks feel like maybe this is unnecessary is that they feel that any sort of regulation in terms of even self-regulation and even considering peer review might stifle innovation, that it could divide what is a fairly small community. Like I said, it's growing exponentially, but it's still fairly small compared to sort of institutionalized science. And that that some sort of regulatory oversight and like an ethics mechanism might create a cool kids table, was a quote that we heard. And so that it might divide the community, and that actually it's unnecessary. The third reason is that it's unnecessary, and that that there are very few moderate or high risk projects that actually need peer review or ethics check-ins, and that there were folks who felt that this was just an overreach and an overreaction by people within the community to police others in the community, and that it was unnecessary. And so those are all super valid criticisms. And, you know, these are also not like, these are not sort of the overarching major voices that we heard, but these were the three opinions that, you know, felt a very strong minority of people feel this way. So, and that's noteworthy. And then we sort of, we had reactions that were sort of existed on a spectrum. So I put these three quotes because I think that this sort of illustrates the spectrum of interviews who gave their thoughts on having some sort of ethics oversight. So the first one saying that I personally would want to defer to someone else, like, yes, like, let's have something, I'd love to submit my project. The second one, the community has a tenuous relationship with bioethicists because they're always just trying to tell them not to do stuff, which I would say that this middle perspective was the one that was probably the majority perspective. What does a bioethicist do besides tell people not to do things? To be honest, I'm not really sure, but that's a great question. And then the last one, a lot of these hackers hate institutional systems and are strongly against them. If you make a board that talks to them about ethics, they're going to say, fuck you, which, yeah, a lot of biohackers say that. A lot of folks in community bio say that. There's, like, you know, like I said in the previous slide, there were some strong voices sort of against any sort of ethics oversight. So it definitely exists on a spectrum. But that said, the majority of people we spoke to said that something was needed. We need something, was a quote that came up repeatedly in this research. And so that begs the question, well, what is that something, right? Well, what can work? There are a bunch of different variations of ethics oversight that exist in existing models, from a traditional IRB to the most sort of nebulous individual ethical reflection, which basically, you know, folks can sit together and just talk amongst themselves, which, you know, definitely works in some projects, and certainly that could be applicable. And what's interesting about community bio is that because it exists on such a spectrum of contexts, whether that's geographic or whether that's funding and resource dependent, or whether that's the number of people involved in a project, so many differences lend themselves to there being a not one, there's no one size fits all solution. to the question of what kind of oversight fits best. Which brings me to the Global Community Biosummit. So full disclosure, I'm a co-organizer for the Global Community Biosummit, have been for a couple of years, and I not only do I help organize the actual conference, I also help with the ethics track. So we have a number of tracks at this conference, and I was a co-lead for the ethics track for a few years running. So the Global Community Biosummit is a conference hosted at the MIT Media Lab, which is in its 4th year. And it's really a place for stakeholders and these sort of nodes in the network of the decentralized community to meet in one place. And there really isn't a lot of options for folks to meet each other, which is really interesting because it's such a decentralized community that exists all over the world. The fact that there is, a couple of ways that people can meet in person, including the Community Biosummit, is really, really important. So people being able to meet face to face, it's like such a magical thing. There are plenty of community bio folks on this call, but I think it really, really changes the conversations when you get to have these conversations in person with folks that you've been chatting with on Facebook for years, and you get to meet them in person. It's really special. And so it's based around collaboration, networking, and developing the movement, which is this grassroots open science practice, basically. And so, like we've seen a few other examples of folks who are involved in community bio, this is just like a random sampling of photos that I had in my social media folder in our shared drive for the Community Biosummit. And so these are all like really good photos, and not everyone looks this beautiful at the Biosummit as these people do. These are ones that were in the social media folder. But I think that this is a really great cross-section of talks and folks that you can find at this kind of event. It's global, it's colorful, there's gender parity, there's a lot of discussion about racial, class, and disability activism, a lot of work about education and outreach. And because it's such an inclusive event, and it's also fully participatory. So the event, when I say I'm a co-organizer, I mean I'm a co-organizer of an event that has 50 other organizers. And it's very colorful and very open. And the main point is that it is fully participatory and 100% collaborative. The participants drive the event and create the programming. And so this is a really crucial part of Biosummit, and also the community bio movement, which is just totally, again, a decentralized horizontal movement for open science. So over the past few years of Biosummits, the community has worked together to sort of hone a vision of what it is that they want and need. So the first Biosummit asked the question, are we a movement? Yes, and the answer was yes. And so the second Biosummit really dug down into the concept of like, okay, well, what's our mission? What's our purpose? And there was a collaborative writing exercise led by Marshall Gans and Abel Kano. And hundreds of people came together to write this very long and complicated sentence, but it's so beautiful. And it happened over the course of 3 days, and a facilitated collaborative writing exercise that ended up with this amazing sentence. Our shared purpose is to fundamentally transform life sciences and democratize biotechnology to inspire creativity and improve lives by organizing life science changemakers and bioenthusiasts to build an inclusive global network, cultivate an accessible commons of knowledge and resources, launch community labs and projects, and enable local educators. So there's like a lot there to unpack. This is a really, really intense mission. But that's sort of the nature of community bio. But if we start to unpack all of the pieces of this sentence, there's a lot of stuff here that in traditional institutional settings does have some sort of ethics oversight. Which brings me to the next part. So at that same Biosummit, which was Biosummit 2.0 in 2018, I also set up with a bunch of other folks who collaborated on the ethics track, these wall exercises. So we wanted to get more of an insight about how people felt about ethics at this actual conference. And like I said, being there in person, it's so different than doing something like this online. And so to me, Post-its are like a magic bullet for getting people to talk about stuff. And so we set up these ethics walls where we really dug down on the things that we knew, but we wanted to expand. So community bio, we knew, was really passionate about this concept of self-regulation and not having outside influence tell members of the community what to do, how to behave, how to run their labs in terms of ethics. And so we asked these very specific questions about, well, how do you feel about law enforcement? Where are you on this spectrum of like, absolutely not, or should we be collaborating with law enforcement? And we asked folks to put their Post-its up here as on a spectrum. And so these are two of my favorite sort of screenshots of this, that safety and ethics concerns are best addressed through horizontal peer and commons-oriented practices. And then very bluntly, I don't trust law enforcement, which is sort of interesting. But the wall exercises themselves were super valuable because, like I said, there's not a lot of opportunities to get the movement all in one place at one time talking about one thing. Social media and the forums are so fragmented. So using these opportunities to really drill down into asking these hard questions is something that I felt was really an opportunity, especially from an ethics research perspective. And so essentially what we're trying to do is, from starting at the defining the values and purpose of the community, we can then move toward defining what the ethics are and the norms and our shared responsibilities based in the values that we find in our statement of purpose. Oh, this is another one I like. Community oversight through openness, conversations, and community-driven ethics / accountability. So taking all of these Post-its and thoughts and great conversations into consideration, I thought, okay, at the next Biosummit, I hope that we can all work together to sort of solidify what we mean when we say, right, community-driven ethics and accountability. What does that mean? Like, let's drill down into it. So at the next Biosummit in 2019, Global Community Biosummit 3.0, along with a bunch of other organizers and community members, we developed this framework for a workshop, which is ultimately the reason why we're all here, to talk about this model that helps us identify ethics in the community bio context. So like we've seen from previous research, the community agrees that it needs something. Some kind of oversight is necessary, and it would be welcomed by a large majority of the community. But I think another key point is that by doing something like this, community bio has an opportunity to redefine and reinvent systems that govern traditional scientific inquiry. But also, so like, yeah, we want to redefine science, but also we can redefine things like IP, publishing, ethics oversight, access, regulation to a bunch of different levels of scientific research. And the community has taken on this like really daunting task of trying to navigate and define what it means when they say they want to redefine all of these incredibly entrenched institutionalized systems. And so we did this workshop. So the workshop is a combination of 3 kinds of collaborative problem-solving techniques. Mostly because I don't think that there's any one way to really do this. Discovering and facilitating the definition of the ethics of a community is a collaborative, collective practice. There's no one way that's going to work best for everyone. So my inspiration for the workshop stemmed from a few different places that I thought might might be able to help with this. So one of those is design thinking, which is a long has a long tradition in product development. And as someone who in a past life was a digital product manager at a newspaper, design thinking is really, really useful for just brainstorming, throw a bunch of stuff on the wall, see what sticks. But then we also used the GAN's leadership development method because it had been familiar to participants, having worked on the shared statement of purpose and doing the collaborative writing exercises the year before. We wanted to just follow up and use something that was familiar but also awesome. And thinking about the ways that Marshall Gans uses personal narrative to try to distill and identify personal norms, and from that, community norms. And then finally, the concept of a supermind and the concept behind Tom Malone's collective intelligence strategies, which basically is that two minds are better than one, communities are better than individuals, but communities that use computing power of some kind are better than communities that don't. And well, what I mean by better is like more effective, more efficient. And so we used a series of different kinds of technologies, from Google Docs to spreadsheets, to data collection, cell phones. So there was a ton of technology involved, which it seems like it's not a big deal, but to imagine doing this without like the Google Sheets, it would be impossible. So this is a process diagram that walks through the workshop and how we went from a workshop to actually having an ethics document that actually came out with a list of identified ethical principles that this community worked together to distill and then shot out. And it happened like this. So there were three parts of the data collection process, which I'm going to go through after this slide. And then there was a transcription period, which was, like I said, color-coded spreadsheets where we started to synthesize and distill the conversations that came out of the workshops. And then finally, an ad hoc group of volunteers that just decided that they were interested in this came together, because this is the nature of Biosummit, anyone can just jump in, came together to analyze all of this data and synthesize it into what ended up being the ethics document. So this is another sort of look at the process flow, sort of a zoom in on parts 1, 2, and 3. So each part of the workshop ran for approximately 15 to 20 minutes. And during each 15 to 20 minute piece, I was facilitating. And that basically just included keeping time and sort of prodding conversations and asking questions within each group. So one of the things that I also want to shout out here is that this is a model that uses a small group, large group, small group, large group organizing tactic. So in smaller groups, it's easier for the step up, step back mantra to happen. So at Biosummit, there is a great philosophy where if you are a person like me who talks all the time and really feels like their voice needs to be heard, you need to step back and let other people step forward and have their voices. And that's just so much easier to do in small groups. So I really am a believer of breaking large groups into as small groups as possible, definitely less than 7, before reconvening to sort of see what all the small groups came up with and compare them and see if there were any major differences or disagreements. So that this workshop uses that model of small and large, just as sort of like check-ins, but also a way to for people to really have a chance to say their piece. Because I mean, that's super it's critical. We can't we can't do this without folks expressing what it is that they have to say. And so the first part really lets people do that, where we ask, what is something that you have experienced in community bio or in your life that you feel the community is grappling with, that's an ethical principle that can be defined. So we asked each participant in small groups to tell a story about the time they encountered an ethical problem. And then each participant wrote down on a Post-it one ethical principle that they felt that was important to themselves or the larger community, and then shared the reason. So this technique of shared narrative, shared storytelling creates these lived experiences in all of us. We have our own lived experiences, but being able to hear from others why they feel a particular ethical principle is absolutely the top of their list because of an experience that they had, not only creates empathy, but their shared lived experience gets shared into ours. And now we can live their experience with them through storytelling. And this is a GANS methodology that I really appreciate, and that I definitely feel is something that doesn't exist in institutional ethics often. You know, narrative ethics exists, but it's just not, it's not something that is really the norm. So I love this so much, and this is why it's part one. So then part two sort of comes back to this, where we think about the ethics that are important to us, and folks wrote down sort of the principles that they thought were important. And the second part is about putting that into practice. So we asked each group to sort of choose one ethical principle. Many didn't listen, and that is fine, because everyone can just do what they want. Basically, if you feel as the spirit moves you, as they say, to choose more than one, that's cool too. And to write something that we should always do and something that we should never do. So action-oriented phrases that that illustrate ways that we can put the ethical principle we identified in part one into practice. So what's a thing that we can always do to put inclusion into practice? So this person write, be aware of who is in the room and not in the room. And that's an always do. And never pretend that there's no difference. Never ignore the differences between people. So we start to see folks not only identifying the ethics that are inherent to themselves as community members, and also that they felt to the community at large, but also really thinking about ways that they can put those ethical principles into practice. And then, so part three is again, large group, right? So everyone came back and we started to group the Post-its together. And you can see in some of these pictures, I don't know how clear it is, but you can see the Post-its are grouped together, and then there's black Sharpie written on the paper behind it. And that was me sort of through the discussion and facilitating the group conversation, starting to group Post-its into sort of principle clusters. So you can see on the top of the on the left-hand image, it says autonomy. And so those are all Post-its that related to sort of this like broader concept of autonomy. And sort of looking at whether there were major disagreements. I want to be really conscious of time. I want to get to some questions. So I'm just going to flip through this. This is data analysis. This is what we did. This is just a screenshot of my spreadsheet where we were writing down all of these Post-its. It got pretty messy. But ultimately it became this through a group of amazing volunteers at the Biosummit who sat in a room for 6 hours with the data from the spreadsheet and really, really thoughtfully went through highlighting the broad ethical principles that are shared across community bio, but also pairing them with the practices that were identified. And just want to be very clear that a lot of the wording on this is directly quoted from the post-its that folks used during the workshop, and came up with this amazing ethics document, not a code of ethics, an ethics document that really sort of expresses where the community is right now, but it also, as you can see, says 1.0. So it's meant to be updated, it's a living document, it's meant to be used, and it's a guide. It's basically a way for any community, bio group, individual, lab, business, anything to sort of look at this and say, okay, how are we being accountable to the community? How are we living up to our ethics? And are our projects sort of on a track of what we've identified as ethical for this community? So this is a great quote. We don't want people making ethical decisions because they fear retribution. We want people making ethical decisions because they decide it's the right thing to do. So this was, again, from our research at Baylor, and I just think that's really powerful. But that's it. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and I hope that folks can unmute themselves or use the chat function to ask questions, and let's open it up for discussion. Thank you so much for listening, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And so let's have folks, if you want to unmute, you can also raise your hands, although I have very little experience with that function on Zoom, but I do have a list of folks, or type into chat. And Alex, you can see the hands of participants too, right?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. If people are raising their hands. I don't see any at the moment, though.
I try to distribute power as much as I can, so.
Well, if anyone has any thoughts or questions about sort of how we did this, what happened, who was involved, how to do it in your own centers or your own environments or contexts, shout it out, or use the chat, or raise your hand, whatever makes you comfortable.
I do. If I don't want to jump in on top of anyone else, but I will ask you. So I don't want to overlook how important and difficult it can be to find agreement about ethical principles. So maybe we can come back to that. But I often go to the disagreement potential first. And I think part of what we're interested in this series of talks is how do you navigate across potential ethical value systems and regulatory systems, right? Yeah. So I'm wondering a couple of things. One is, I know you did some research on ethical codes around the world, Nuremberg, Helsinki, things like that. And so I'm wondering what you saw come up in this group that really departed from those codes. And then also where you saw some examples of real disagreement among the group and how that got navigated and worked out.
Thanks, that's such a good question. So yeah, so there's two answers. So 2 questions, 2 answers. So the first one is, what were the disagreements? And I think the biggest one that you don't see here, which sort of ties into the second question, that you do see on a lot of traditional codes of ethics is being in line with law enforcement and being in line with regulation. And this is such a difficult question for the community because whose regulations? Who's law enforcement? Because this is a community that spans such a global distributed network, it's impossible to say that if one collaborator is in Austria and one is in Costa Rica, whose like very tight or very loose regulations should the research be in line with? And so that's one that was such an issue of disagreement that I just wanted to move on, to be honest. You know, this was, it's sort of like another question for another day about law enforcement, because there's no way we are going to solve that problem in an hour, but also I think it's probably going to take decades. So not only is it going to take not an hour, but this is a question that is going to be ongoing and is going to need to be teased out by the community and by regulators for the next few years. But to the second part of your question, another part of another principle that emerged that is not part of sort of traditional codes of ethics is the question of credit and attribution. And because in sort of traditional research spheres, the concept of openness doesn't really exist. There's this like tight hold on intellectual property, and there are paywalls of scientific research, and there are the towers exist, right? And by demolishing the towers and demolishing those guardrails and gatekeepers and making everything open creates a problem of folks who do want attribution for their ideas. Even if they want to give it away for free, even if they want to be open, want to allow other people to build on it, they still want to say, hey, I came up with that. And that's totally valid and acceptable, but it's not something we had really seen before. And it's not something that exists on traditional codes of ethics just because of the nature of the way that the traditionally research has been done. So I see Todd has his hand raised. Todd.
Yeah, so just a great talk. So, I mean, I know you know this, but you know, the community, and maybe no one really likes to talk about money and costs. So
Yeah.
I'm curious in your thoughts on like how something like this would actually be put into existence, and whether it would cost anything, and if it would cost something, where are those revenues coming from to be able to actually sustain this over the long term?
Well, so I think that we should be specific about what is it that we're spending money on. So I think, for just using this ethics guide as a guide where a group of people sit down over their experiment with maybe themselves or invite a couple of specialists in and answer the questions, that seems like it might be free. But if we were to create something like an actual group within the community, some sort of peer review council or ethics review group, I don't want to say IRB because that is such an institutional concept, but something akin to that, then yeah, I think that might cost money. And I think, that there are community labs that do make money who might, there might be a subscription model, there might be a pay for service model. And there also might be a model where companies that have come out of this community maybe are collectively funding some sort of group just to have like basic infrastructure like web hosting fees and liability insurance, which is something that that I know that you had before with biosafety experts. So if there were bioethics experts, do they also need liability insurance? Those kinds of things do cost money. And I think that there are a number of models sort of available for ways to fund stuff, but that the community itself, is just on the cusp of having those conversations. And I don't know of any that have been like cemented or solidified at all. There's a question in the chat. Hanif is wondering if community bio is bringing efficiency, and whether it increases utility of individuals by giving them access, but does it increase the utility of the science as well? So this is a really complicated question because I think it depends on the project that you are considering. So I think on the whole, is it bringing efficiency on par with traditional top-down institutions? As a person who has organized events, like let's just think about like the networking events at top-down institutions versus the Community Biosummit, I will say, no, it's not super efficient. But is it more fun? Is it better? Does it make it more equitable? Is it more inclusive? Absolutely. And so we have to ask questions about like, is efficiency the thing that we want to be aiming for? Or are we really looking to expand who is able to do research, whose voices are not being included? And the work to sort of open up these structures is often super inefficient. And it takes a long time. It doesn't happen overnight. But that's okay, because if efficiency is what we're going for, then probably community bio is not the best place. But if that's sort of a lower priority and you're more interested in equity and accessibility, then prioritizing those things sometimes pushes efficiency to the back end. Does anyone else have a question?
There's another question, Lillian, right above Hanif's question, and then Daniel Grishkin has his hand up.
Oh, okay. Okay, Lillian, my question is, do you think that since the ethics document was developed, there would be introductions of bias? Yes, I think Lillian asked, would there be introductions of bias in some really important ethical issues that would be neglected? And the answer is yes. Anytime you do any kind of these exercises with a group where they're telling their own stories and sharing their own personal narratives, it's biased in their favor. And it, by sort of the nature of the work, leaves people out who aren't there. And so voices can't be heard or represented by folks who aren't in the room. And so this is why we're always trying to open the room, but also why we want to be very clear that this kind of document is a living document, and that there's no like cap on it. There's no like, this is it when we all celebrate. No, the work is ongoing. And we want to make sure that any biases that do exist are brought to light. And important ethical principles that might have been missed, maybe they make it into the next iteration. And we continue to have these conversations and continue to push folks to really engage with it. If you don't feel like your voice is being heard or represented, then we invite you to tell us to step back, right? So that we want to make sure that we're stepping back enough so that folks feel that they can step forward and share those voices. Dan Grushkin is here, who is the editor-in-chief of Biodesign magazine, which I am a writer for and an editor for. And he wants to ask a question, but first I would like to plug our magazine. So everyone needs to go to biodesign.org and read our stuff. Dan.
Here's a quick question for you. I just wanted to talk about incentive structures and disincentive structures. So how do you incentivize community labs to actually adhere to any sets of codes of ethics? How do you disincentivize them when they've decided that they're going to flout them?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important question. And I know that I have a lot of thoughts about that are my personal thoughts about how to incentivize community labs, including like making it part of the, I actually think it should be part of the code of conduct agreement. If you come to Biosummit, are you signed up for this ethics document? Are you going to put it into use? Are you going to say that it's going to be a thing that governs your work? Is this our code of conduct? Is this part of like how we conduct ourselves and responsibly? And we're all agreeing to that if we're members of the community. That's my opinion. There hasn't been a sort of agreed upon way to incentivize or disincentivize bad behavior. I will say though that I think that there are a couple of labs who have used it, and I think that there are interesting ways that it's being built upon, and there are sort of forks of it being used in different ways. So I also want to do a better job keeping track, because I think that there may be people using it or groups using it, and we don't know about it, and we don't know the ways that they're using it, and they might be doing it in a really creative way. So I think that it's the job of a group of maybe volunteers or folks who are interested in this to sort of do follow-up surveys and further research. And that's something that I definitely want to do more of. But at the moment, unfortunately, don't have a great answer for that. And for the moment, to be honest, disincentivizing bad behavior is really just the same way that it's always been in this community, which is shouting people out on Facebook or vague booking or like subtweeting, which is terrible and not the way to handle disagreements in a community, but that is where we're at, unfortunately, right this minute. Lisa is asking, have you started getting feedback about how people are using the code? So I think Maria is here, or she was. Maria Chavez, I think you had done, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Maria is a leader at BioCurious, which is a community lab in the Bay Area of California. And there had been a discussion about using this framework and using the document on one of the experiments at BioCurious, or at least there was a tweet to that effect. Maria, I don't know if you, okay, Maria's, yep, we use it. Maria's in the chat. Maria is super busy and probably, oh, and it's been officially voted in by the board. Awesome, thank you. And so I also know that there were folks involved in the creation of this document who are also working on Just One Giant Lab, Joggle, which is a networking platform for members of the community to work on specific projects. And so it hasn't been officially sort of part of their sort of hierarchy in the Joggle platform, because they now have an official biosafety board, and they have some leadership that exists at Joggle that were involved in the creation of this document. And I don't think it's been official on Joggle, but certainly there's a lot of overlap. So it's going to be interesting to see if they actually use it and who else uses it. Okay, thanks, Gordon. Gordon asks, one question that follows from this is whether you've had luck getting institutional structures to adopt the code. How do funding officers and so forth to respond when you show up with this? Still far enough out of major institutional context. Yeah, we haven't had to deal with it. And also, like, I generally, I don't go to funding officers. I'm a freelance journalist. So. If others have some experience with this, that they can answer. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is fairly far out of institutional contexts. But that said, like I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I hope that it can also be useful inside institutional context, because I think the question of shared narrative and personal storytelling and lived experience is massively missing from institutional context. So using something like this that prioritizes sort of everyone's voices and sort of personal narrative is something that I think could do a lot of good. Based on what I've seen inside of institutions, I think that this is something that could be super useful. So I hope that it can make its way in, but as far as I know, we haven't had to deal with it. Thanks, Maria. See you later. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? I'm looking for raised hands. It doesn't look like it. Well, if no one else has anything to ask or say or thoughts or comments, I'd just like to say thank you so much for having me, Gordon and Lisa. Yeah. This was super fun. I love talking about this. This is my favorite kind of work. So.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. This is fantastic. So I'm starting to check in the chat. Just a reminder, this is only the second in a series of talks on this. We'll have more for you as we get them organized. Also, the center is doing a series on disability this year. We had Rosemary Garland Thompson speak last week. If you missed it, it's now on the YouTube channel. So notice the clever advert for the YouTube channel. It's brand new, so there's now one video up. But this will also be up soon, so you can look at that. Again, it's the ethics.uncc.edu is where you can find the webpage with a link to all the other events. And there's also a link to Facebook and stuff like that if you look for us. So thank you very much to everyone, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.